There's a challenge that the Gospels couldn't have been written by the apostles because they were uneducated and untrained. As in Acts 4:13. The detractors, of course, prefer the King James Version. They were unlearned and ignorant. Let me begin by observing that those calling Peter and John unlearned and ignorant were from the community who knew them as fishermen. That was nothing more than an uneducated bias by the crowd. And they said that because they were witnessing something contrary to their bias. It could be interpreted as a declaration of the opposite, like, "What are they doing? It's amazing. And how can they be doing this?" That's really what they're saying. I'm assuming that detractors of the Gospels running with that has its roots in Bart Ehrman. I haven't read his Did Jesus Exist book, but I bought it and I have it and I'll get to it. I will be curious to see if my observation holds that detractors of the Gospels mostly base their objections on argument from silence. That is, something like, records supposedly so important should have included this or that, but it doesn't. Or, the Gospels weren't signed by the authors, so we assume that the unknown authors are not eyewitnesses. Or, literacy in Palestine at that time is estimated to be about 3%, or maybe 20% if you only account for the adult male population, but detractors will, of course, choose the lower statistic. Therefore, the apostles couldn't have written the Gospels. That statistic of 3% or 20% is a population estimate. We're talking about a dozen or so specific men. And that those men were illiterate is, again, an argument from silence. Something in my other life sent me down a different thought path. As a plant manager, I was required to inspect a product and approve it for shipment, a massive piece of equipment that was built in Belgium. In getting to know the staff there in Belgium, I learned that most of them were literate and spoke several languages, simply because it was necessary. The small country of Belgium did business with their close neighbors, France, Germany, the Netherlands, England. They had to be able to communicate. So let's look at Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus and James. He was called a carpenter. Actually, it was a general term for construction and maintenance, a skilled craftsman in all sorts of materials. In his business, it would not be unlikely that he would need to speak Hebrew and Greek, and maybe even Latin. This would be the home in which Jesus and his brothers grew up. And, as I said, one of those brothers was James. And James became bishop of the church in Jerusalem. That's obviously a prestigious people position and a teaching position. I can't imagine him being a bishop without literacy in at least a couple languages. Then there's Jesus' choice for followers. Jesus didn't choose the elite, the 1%, the entitled, the highly educated. He chose men grounded in reality, men who understood life. Jesus avoided the highly educated, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because they had been poisoned by that very education, like having a Princeton or Berkeley education today. Learning a lot of stuff that's wrong, relying on their peer review, which was wrong. Really, think about it. But Jesus' chosen followers, not being steeped in peer-reviewed doctrine, being unlearned and ignorant, says nothing about their IQ. I've heard that IQs vary little among siblings. Notice that Jesus chose two pairs of brothers, perhaps from families he knew had high ability to learn, high ability to think abstractly, to think critically, to understand. Also, they were fishermen. That is, they were engaged in a commercial venture like Jesus's stepfather Joseph, and likely were multilingual. Jesus chose men who were active in society. Detractors refer to ignorant and superstitious goat herders. None of Jesus' disciples were goat herders who lived solitary lives. When we're willing to do a deep dive into the Gospels without a Princeton bias, what we see makes so much sense. To me, the narrative of the Gospels not only makes sense, but it's absolutely brilliant. Jesus didn't choose men who were. He chose followers who could become. He needed to work with new wineskins, not old ones. Yeah, Jesus was brilliant.